Although we can be confident on the basis of the testimony of Scripture and even Jesus himself that the book of Genesis comes from the days of Moses, we should note that we cannot be sure precisely when Moses completed these stories as we have them now. Whatever the case, we may safely say that Moses' main concern when writing the history of Abraham would have been very similar for either generation. He wrote about Abraham to turn their hearts away from Egypt and toward possessing the Promised Land. This general implication for the original audience can hardly be overemphasized. Moses wrote to encourage the nation of Israel following him never to return back to Egypt and to succeed in the conquest of Canaan. And this broad implication guides us in our modern application of Abraham's life. As Christians, we are on a journey that actually completes the journey begun by Israel in the days of Moses. We're moving toward the new heavens and the new earth. So, for us to apply Abraham's stories properly to our lives, we must pay attention to the ways they instructed the original audience to keep moving toward Canaan. To unpack this overarching focus a bit, we should look into Moses' purpose in more detail by returning to the four major themes we've already identified in this portion of Genesis. You'll recall that earlier in this lesson, we suggested that Genesis chapter 12 verses 1 through 3 presents at least four themes that give coherence to this part of the patriarchal history. These four themes express the central impact Moses designed his stories to have. First, he focused on divine grace to Abraham. Second, he concentrated on Abraham's loyalty. Third, he was concerned with blessings to Abraham. And fourth, he focused on blessings through Abraham. It helps to think of Moses' original purpose for writing about Abraham in terms of these four motifs. In the first place, Moses wrote about the ways God had shown mercy to Abraham. In broad terms, we've already seen that God showed much grace to Abraham, both in the early years of his relationship with God and on a daily basis throughout his entire life. This motif of divine grace was designed to remind the Israelites in Moses' day that God had shown great mercy to them as well. God had shown them early grace when he brought them from Egypt to Sinai, and day after day, he continued to show them mercy, even as he prepared them for the future conquest of Canaan. The well-known words God spoke at Sinai in Exodus chapter 19 verse 4 speak of God's grace in this way: "You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself." Sadly, the Israelites whom Moses led had forgotten how much mercy they had received from God. Early on, they complained that God and Moses had cheated them by taking them away from the comforts of Egypt. They complained about food and water in the wilderness. They thought God had asked too much of them when he called them to enter the conquest for the Promised Land. So Moses frequently stressed the ways God showed mercy to Abraham to remind his original audience of the ways God had blessed them, the mercies God had shown to them over and over. In the second place, we've seen that Moses also emphasized Abraham's loyalty by drawing attention to the many ways God held Abraham responsible to obey his commands. Moses repeatedly emphasized that God expected the patriarch to be faithful to his commands because this focus was also relevant for the Israelites who followed him. This focus on the requirement of loyalty also spoke to Israel in Moses' day. Listen to the way God continued to address Israel at Mount Sinai in Exodus chapter 19, verses 4 and 5. "You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession." Notice here that the blessings of becoming a treasured possession were dependent on Israel's faithfulness. Although God has shown much mercy to the nation, the status of each person in each generation depended on how they responded to the commands of God.